Hello, and welcome to today's discussion, All Things Supply Chain. My name is Clayton Cottle, and I'm the president of the Sam Houston State University MBA Student Association, where we're dedicated to building networks and building careers. Today's discussion marks our third and final installment of the 2020 fall semester. Thank you for tuning in. At this time, I'll now turn it over to the Director of Relations, today's moderator, Jamie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Dietrich, and I'm the Relations Officer or Director of Relations now for the MBA Student Association. Today, we're going to talk about one of the many segments within business, supply chain and supply chain management. I'm really excited about today's discussion, so let's jump in and have our experts introduce themselves and tell us a bit about their background. Justin, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Clayton, for hosting us. So I'm Justin Burnett. I graduated from Sam Houston in 2002. And shortly after that, started my career in supply chain, working for a small consulting firm. And you know, sort of a year or two after my graduation from school, went to work in oil and gas. And I started with Chevron Upstream Oil and Gas in the supply chain organization in Houston. Subsequently worked in Venezuela, Indonesia, and I left Chevron Indonesia to work for BP in Baku, Azerbaijan until 2010. And moved back to Houston at that point in time. My wife and family and I have been here since. So my career has been predominantly supply chain, a lot of international, sort of half my career has been living overseas and working overseas. But I would say one of the things is I wasn't always in supply chain. I didn't always think I was going to study supply chain coming out of school, and I sort of fell into it, and it's been a great career path. So I'm interested to talk about that today, Jamie, and I appreciate you having me here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Sweeney, would you like to do a brief introduction?
Sure. Thank you both, Jamie and Clayton, for hosting this for us. I'm Kevin Sweeney. I'm a professor here at Sam Houston State. Technically, I'm an assistant professor of supply chain management here. I did some work for some consulting companies when I was younger, right after I graduated from undergrad, but I've spent most of my life involved in academia. And much like Justin, I did not start off in supply chain, nor did I ever really picture that as where I was going to end up. I started off with a heavy focus in mathematics and economics as a kid, and took that into undergraduate territory at Truman State, where I got my BA. And then from there, I kind of gravitated towards trying to solve transportation economics problems, and that sort of was a long roundabout way of me arriving at the discipline of supply chain management where I am now. So while I do have some experience in the working world, the vast majority of my work in supply chain has been mostly from an academic perspective, both research and teaching it in the classroom.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you both so much for volunteering your time to our organization. We're so thankful and fortunate to have esteemed alumni and faculty willing to provide their expertise to our graduate students. So let's go ahead and get started. So obviously today, we're going to be using the term supply chain a lot. So in order for us to start on common ground, Dr. Sweeney, will you give us a simple overview of supply chain and supply chain management? And Justin, you're following up, so be ready.
All right, thank you.
All right, so supply chain has become actually, I think, a little harder to define as time has gone on, because it started to encompass a lot more of a firm's value-added activities than it used to. But broadly speaking, the idea of supply chain management, at least from my perspective, is essentially managing the product provision process, which starts at the gathering of raw materials or the gathering of any types of components that might be necessary to provide some service or product for customers, manages that through the firm itself, and then also sees the transfer of that service or product to some final customer, whether it's a B2B transaction or a B2C transaction. And every step that's involved in that process of gathering, which we call procuring, making, though not directly making, but facilitating the manufacture or the provision of service, and then getting it to a customer, I think would fall under supply chain management for most of today's firms.
Yeah, and Kevin, I'll jump in there. I think you described it very well, and I'm conscious I didn't actually identify my job title earlier when I was introducing myself, but I currently serve as the Vice President for Materials Management and Warehousing for BP, and I think the reason I say that is it's going to help with my definition. Is my job role for BP at this time is to make sure that the products that we need, the materials we need to produce offshore oil and gas or onshore oil and gas is moved from supplier manufacturer to our facilities and held for a certain period of time until we need those items, and then used in the production operation. So it's the physical movement, storage, and they call it the care, custody, and control of materials for upstream oil and gas. But I think, to add to Kevin's point, I think one of the things that I've learned over time about the definition of supply chain is we tend to think about a very manufacturing mindset of, we have a manufacturer that has raw materials, creates something that creates a product that people need, and they ship it to people, which is predominantly what people think about when it comes to supply chain. But I think there's a whole services aspect that people need to start incorporating, which is contracts, it's people, it's getting people to certain locations that have certain skill sets. And it's an important aspect of supply chain, which starts to blend into the legal side of supply chain, which is terms and conditions, day rates for people, compensation for people. So when you think about supply chain, don't just think about the physical materials of supply chain, the manufacturing of that. Also think about the services that come with those things. And services happen all over the world. So it's important to know sort of both aspects of the supply chain.
Awesome. Well, great description of that. We appreciate it. So now that we all have a basic understanding, we have a few questions that are going to be geared toward our students who are considering a career in supply chain, or they might kind of be on the fence and trying to learn more about it. So first, are there specific characteristics or traits that are sought after in professionals wanting to pursue a career in the industry? Justin, we'll let you take this first.
Specific traits. I think one of the things I would say of successful supply chain people that I've seen over the years is, one, I think you have to be pretty robust in your thinking, as far as, I think traditional supply chain has been very single-minded, and Kevin sort of mentioned the manufacturing a product to a supplier. But as we've grown in the supply chain is changing every day. And I think with technology, with artificial intelligence, with even the challenges we've had with COVID, what supply chain professionals have to have is an adaptive mindset. What you did last week or last year may not be practical today, or may not be the most efficient way to get products or services to someone. And so you have to keep challenging the status quo to be really successful. If you say, I'm just going to keep doing it as we did it last time, or this is how we've always done it, you're not going to be competitive. You're not going to stay competitive. You're not going to stay the most efficient supply chain you can be. So I think you've got to be asking questions. You've got to be adaptive. You've got to be inquisitive. And if you can do that and keep driving yourself to be different and keep challenging the status quo, I think you'll be pretty successful.
Great. Dr. Sweeney, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree completely with Justin in the sense, and I'm going to try to phrase it, I think, a little bit differently, because I think from an academic side, this is really what it is that we're trying to give to students specifically, which is supply chain is really a way of thinking about problems. It's not necessarily a specific set of approaches that you take to solving problems that are put in front of you. It's really a way of thinking about different parts of solving business problems that may translate, hopefully, into different ways of solving those problems, as Justin has alluded to. I know many stories of people who have gone into new firms and managing supply chains and have seen people doing things the same ways that they've done them for 20 or 30 years, and immediately been able to point out all of the issues that arise because of the way that they've been treating this operation for so long. And so it really requires a different way of thinking. Like, you're there to solve problems, not necessarily use any specific tools that you've been given in any of the classes or coursework that you have up until that point. And I think that really makes it unique from something like accounting or finance, where you typically come in with a lot of the tools and ideas already well molded. It's a very fast moving industry, and you have to be ready to adapt to that.
Yeah, and Kevin, I'll just add it back in. I think your point is spot on. And as individuals coming out of school, I mean, the best advice I would tell them is, don't be afraid to be confident in yourself and challenging the status of how things are certainly done. I think people in supply chain professions, to your point, appreciate a fresh set of eyes that may question why something is done a certain way, or is there a better way of doing it? And one of the advantages that students coming out today have potentially versus someone like myself that's been in the industry for 20 years is that, we've been doing it for a while, and perhaps we get into a mindset of, this is how it's done. I love when people come in and ask me why. why do we have to do it that way? I've learned this, or I've seen this, or I do this in my own personal life, and I think it would be applicable here. Don't be afraid to challenge. Be confident in yourself. Be energetic, and ask some questions. People, most of the folks you'll work with in the environment will appreciate that.
Well, that's great advice. I think so many times entering into the workforce for the first time, it's so easy to shy away from those questions because you feel like you're challenging your leadership, but really you're just trying to contribute. So that is wonderful advice.
And do it in the right way, right? I mean, there's a way to come in and be confident, but not be cocky.
Yeah.
There's a difference there, but for sure, most people will appreciate the fresh set of eyes and appreciate the challenge if you do it in the right way.
Mm.
Awesome. Well, Clayton and I had to do a little bit of reading in preparation for today's discussion. So one of the things we read was that research suggests that up to 80% of manufacturers will have multi-country operations by the end of 2020. So considering this fact and the increased need for workers globally, what steps can our students take to be more competitive? Dr. Sweeney, we'll let you start, and Justin, you can follow up on this one.
Okay.
Ooh, man, that's a lot. So here's what I would say, and this is probably going to be true for a lot of MBA students in general, I would say, but for supply chain in particular, I think it's very important. You cannot be afraid to put yourself in situations that you're uncomfortable with in supply chain. And by that, I mean, you really have to be willing to go to the source of problems typically in order to investigate them fully and really have an understanding of what's going on. So in a more globally oriented world, that means that you're going to have to be okay with travel. You're going to have to be okay with potentially being located in other places for periods of time in order to really get an understanding of what's going on. Now that provides you with a tremendous opportunity to understand things and see things that you would not be able to understand, see, or appreciate otherwise. But it really is something that you can't shy away from in today's economy. The day of working for a specific firm in a specific place for your entire life really is being challenged with the way things are going on right now. Now, COVID has kind of put a little bit of a pause button on that for temporary purposes, right? But the overall trend of business seems to be a much more globally integrated way of doing business, which means that you have to be thinking about the possibilities and potentials of going global. Get interested in new cultures, interested in languages, things that would facilitate your ability to be useful to companies and provide value.
Yeah, and Kevin, I think you answered that really well. And as I read this question and heard you ask the question, Jamie, I struggle with it a little bit. And the reason I say that is I was very lucky, and I say lucky for a reason, because early on in my career, I had the ability to move internationally. As I said, my wife and I both moved to Venezuela, and we were 25 years old, and subsequently lived in Indonesia and Azerbaijan, and then came back to the States. So we had a very blessed life to be able to live and experience many different cultures, and that helped my career expansion a lot as well. I mean, it did help my development at a much faster pace. And I think what Kevin said is right, is that I think with COVID and also with just the ability we have with technology today to communicate has increased exponentially. And obviously the experience with COVID has pushed that forward probably even by a faster 5 or 10 years.
Right.
We've had to adjust because of technology and because of the lack of travel. But Kevin, to your point, I think the more people can develop themselves to understand how different cultures work, understand the complexities in different countries, especially when it comes to supply chain. I can tell you that I've dealt with complexities in supply chain of logistics and government relations and other challenges that you get that you don't normally get in the US. If you stay just insular to what happens in the US and the cultures of the US, then you're going to be limited. The more you can adapt yourself to understand how the countries work, how the people think, what's important to people. I mean, what's important to typical Americans as far as work-life balance is very different in other countries. And so the more you can understand that and listen and learn and want to really just appreciate and enjoy other cultures will develop yourself to be a better overall individual when it comes to supply chain or just in business in general. I don't know if the ability or the capability to live internationally is going to be as high as it used to be. I just think that companies are going to be challenged with costs of putting someone from the U.S. potentially into another country. But I think the opportunity to live and the opportunity to work, though, even remotely with other countries and cultures, is only going to grow. And Jamie, you mentioned, I think 80%, but it's going to grow a lot faster than that. And I think so. The more you can round yourself out, the more you can, once travel becomes more of a thing back again, I think the more you can travel and understand or talk to people from different cultures, and not just find out about the culture, but find out what the challenges they have in those countries. Is it power? Is it water? Is it infrastructure? Is it logistics? Is it government relations? Find out what the challenges are, and then what are some of the things you can do to help bridge those gaps.
I'd like to add one more thing onto that, which is my advice for this question would be very different for undergraduates and graduate students. I know that you mentioned that there would be some elements of both watching this, in the sense that graduate students typically have access to opportunities and previous work experience that allows them to make these transitions a lot easier than people who are coming directly out of undergrad. And while I would encourage undergraduate students to do everything they can to broaden their horizons in order to put themselves in good positions in supply chain, I do recognize that that's not necessarily a very easy thing to do for some undergraduate students, and that it is by far not the only path you can take to put yourself in a good position in supply chain management going forward.
I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Sweeney. That was actually one of my next questions. I was going to ask each of you for a key piece of advice that you would offer to our students that are kind of teetering on the fence of supply chain or some other aspect of business. But also, there's some pros and cons. Like, is there a reason you would recommend a career in this or a reason that you wouldn't?
Yeah, do you want me to go first? I would say, last piece of advice is if you can move and work internationally, I would encourage everyone to do that. I mean, I know the opportunities may be limited, and especially now with COVID, but if you get a chance to live somewhere else in the world, even just if it's relocating within the United States, or if you do get the opportunity to move to another country, I would really encourage you to do it. I know there's a lot of people that I've met in my career that are pretty hesitant to want to move, and I've lived in some places that people would not consider vacation spots, but they've been fantastic places to live. So I would really encourage everyone, if you get the opportunity, travel, get out, find a job that will allow you the opportunity to move and get different places. But, as far as advice, whether, pros and cons of supply chain, the one thing I would say to recognize is that supply chain as a core skill set is transferable across almost every industry. And so if you go in and let's say, for example, you're a drilling engineer for oil and gas, and that's been your core, career path, you're pretty limited. I mean, you're a drilling engineer and you perhaps could go into drilling water wells, or maybe not just for oil and gas, but other opportunities with drilling, but you're still fairly limited. With the supply chain background, you've got the medical industry, you've got the retail industry, you've got the grocery industry, Amazon. Supply chain spans across every industry and is required, whether it comes to products or services, and everything we do. And again, I think COVID has highlighted the importance of supply chain, of getting products and materials and people to where they need to go in a relatively short amount of time and be efficient in doing that. And you can see that with things such as masks or PPE that are needed in the medical field, or even just products and services or food for people as travel shuts down and restrictions of manufacturing happens. What happens to that supply chain? And so I would encourage you to think that supply chain is going to be resilient in anything that happens in the future. And it is a pretty resilient career path to have. So it's just something to consider. And it's one thing I really appreciate is that as the landscape of oil and gas is changing and looking at more alternative energy, I have the ability to go into alternative energy supply chain, or I can just go into a completely different thing and go work for a grocer or retail, or like I said, even someone in the medical field.
I think that's a really important thing to consider, especially this hopefully soon post-COVID era that we're entering into, because we don't know what that job market's going to look like. And Dr. Sweeney, were you fixing to add something?
I would say that I've seen one particular student that I remember from my days back at Maryland before I came to Sam Houston, who in a span of 3 years worked for Kroger, the Department of Defense, and the Baltimore County Hospital all in a row as a supply chain person using skill set across 3 vastly different industries. Bang, 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 just like that. So it's definitely the path. A supply chain manager takes a very different path throughout industry than most other jobs do.
Yeah, it's a great point. That's what I was trying to hint at, Kevin. So I think you've used a great example there. But and that's the thing is, if you get bored with one industry or want a different challenge, you can fairly easily pop across different industries.
All right. Well, let's shift our focus just a little bit and talk about our intra and entrepreneurial students. So how important is it for a young growing company to keep their supply chain management in-house, or are they better off in the short, or is it a long-term situation with going with a third-party provider? And Dr. Sweeney, will direct this to you first, and Justin, you can follow up.
Man, you're giving me all the hard ones first.
Sorry.
Well, you're the expert. I'm just here.
So the answer to this question, of course, like everything else in supply chain management, is that it depends. But I'd say that the larger scale issue that you have to answer as a company when you tackle this question is the supply chain process a core part of my value proposition to customers or not? You know, for example, do I want to pride myself as a company on taking ownership of the entirety of the supply chain, working directly with my suppliers on my own and working directly with my customers on my own, and making that relationship and those interactions part of what I provide my customers? If the answer to that is yes, to some degree, you definitely want to control some parts of your supply chain. Now, how much and how tightly depends on your industry, probably. But if that's part of your answer, then you probably do want to control pieces of it. On the flip side, there are industries out there or companies out there whose main tenant isn't necessarily controlling the distribution or supply of their products or services. They're focused on other things like design or other types of efficiency in manufacturing specifically, or raw material stuff that doesn't really lend itself to the supply chain aspect. And in that sense, it may be okay for businesses to give control of that to third-party logistics providers like UPS or FedEx or DHL even. There's reasons those companies are so big, because for a lot of companies, interacting with customers or suppliers just isn't what they want to be their core competency.
Yeah, and Kevin, I'll add to that. I think you started out with the right description with it depends, and that's been my experience through my career. And I'll give you 2 examples when I say it depends. So if you look at BP, for example, where I work in supply chain, not a core. I mean, our core is we want to produce energy for the world. We want to produce light, heat, and mobility for the world, and that's BP's intent. We're not a supply chain company. Therefore, we know there are people out there that can execute warehouses better, can deliver products for us in a more efficient way. And so what we need to do is constantly challenge ourselves of how can we be more efficient, and not just from a cost perspective, but from a carbon footprint perspective. And therefore, there may be others that can do that in a better way. And so over time, we looked at outsourcing certain aspects of that, and that's been a big benefit for us as a company. On the flip side of that, you look at someone like Amazon, and Amazon is growing exponentially in their supply chain, and they're insourcing more and more as they go. And, if you look at what Amazon's doing is, so BP, for instance, for the last 5-10 years, has been trying to reduce our footprint of warehouses and move it further away from high cost locations. Amazon's going the other way. Amazon's building warehouses every day, and they're trying to get closer and closer to the customers so they can shorten their supply chain for delivery, where now you can, sometimes order something online and get it within a few hours because they're getting closer and closer to their customers. And they're insourcing more. They're buying their own trucks. They're buying their own planes. They're thinking they can do it faster and more efficient than somebody else can when it comes to storing and moving products and materials. So that's their core strength. They are a supply chain, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think there are differences there, and it just depends on what those companies find is their core strength. Can they be more competitive if they bring it in-source versus outsource? So it's going to be something that is constantly challenged. And I can tell you that at a company like BP, I'll admittedly say that we've had the pendulum swing back and forth a couple times, depending on what it was. At some point in time, we think we want to in-source something, and then we find a supplier that can do it better, and we outsource it, and we we tend to swing ourselves back and forth quite a bit on that view. But it does depend, and it depends on how competitive you can be, and if you can find something that's a little more cost effective as you go. So it will always keep going back and forth. I think some, like Amazon, have proven they can do it really, really well. And beat out their competition, or perhaps even beat out someone that their core competency is logistics. And it just shows how powerful somebody can be if they're really good at something.
Dr. Sweeney, do you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it's supply chain really is a strategic consideration for firms now, in that you can have firms whose entire goal is to compete on the efficiency or the service provided by their supply chain. Amazon and Walmart are retailers nominally, but really they make their edge in supply chain. They're able to offer prices that are low and delivery times that are very short as a result of their excellence in supply chain. The retail store is basically just a way for them to show off the fruits of their supply chain labors. And so you can compete using supply chain as your main competitive edge if you want to. You don't have to, but it's a new strategic option, and that's really only been something that firms have been able to do, maybe I'd say for the past 25 or 30 years or so, as information technology has allowed us to really get more data and see more of what's going on inside of our businesses simultaneously. So that, again, it's the same way that you can be low cost or high, I always forget that word. High service. It's not high service. It's differentiation. That's the word I'm looking for a business strategy. I think excellence in supply chain can compete around those two and be a third mechanism for businesses to make their name for themselves.
Yep.
So we talked a little bit about COVID before, and Clayton and I decided it wouldn't be 2020 without some sort of COVID question in here. So this is actually a two-part question. So Dr. Sweeney, I'm going to ask the first part to you, and then Justin, I'm going to direct the second part to you, and I'll do the second part in just a minute. So first, what was the biggest weakness in our country's supply chains that COVID has exposed?
This is probably an answer that would make some people in industry a little angry, but that's okay, because I think it's kind of the truth. We, for a long time as an industry, chased efficiency to the point that we weren't really ready for something on the scale of COVID to disrupt initially. And the efficiency was a good thing to chase when there were no major outstanding huge problems. But I think what we've now begun to realize as a result of COVID-19 in particular, and maybe with a few clues earlier on in the decade with the earthquake in Fukushima and a couple other places, that if you chase efficiency all the way down, you end up in a situation where you just don't have the ability to deal with true emergencies. And I think COVID exposed that flaw in supply chain efficiency thinking for everyone to see.
Okay. And
Yeah, Jamie, can I just add to that one a little bit too? I think Kevin's right, and I think the other thing I would add is one of the challenges that I saw was information is so readily available. It's so quick. I mean, whether it's social media or, we have 1,000 news channels now versus the 3 we used to have back when I was a kid. And I think that the challenge that I saw with that is misinformation can be shared so fast. And one of the things that happened shortly after COVID hit and things started to happen, move and things started to come on lockdown was the ability to spread misinformation around what was available, what wasn't going to be available, whether it was toilet paper or food or masks. Or in reality, our supply chain worked pretty well. I mean, as Kevin said, we were efficient. There were a lot of challenges that happened, and I think we probably learned some things around were we too efficient and how we cut too much to the core, trying to save too much. But we do have a really competent supply chain, and the ability for us to move things across the globe is better than it's ever been. But we can't beat misinformation, and so that threw panic into some people early. And it caused people to start hoarding, and it caused overconsumption or overpurchase, especially when it comes to products. And that is what put the real challenge on the supply chain is if everyone would have sort of just gone about their normal day and only consumed or only purchased what they needed actually, and didn't think of the doomsday sort of, I better buy as much as I can, I think would have been okay. I think would have been a much better place. It's just people start spreading misinformation and things get shared and things get challenged. And I'll give you an example of that. HEB, which is, for those that aren't familiar with it's a local grocer here it's only really in Texas or South Texas for the most part, but a very competent supply chain, a very competent company, been around a long time. And I remember seeing where they had actually said they were going to start getting certain social media posts deleted if they couldn't validate the date of when the picture was taken or when it was posted of, look at the shelves of HEB, we don't have toilet paper, we don't have paper towels, we don't have lettuce or milk or whatever else. Because their supply chain was so good, they were able to replenish quite quickly on things that needed. But people, again, were panicking because they would see a picture that was posted. And, if something was going to be replenished the next day, didn't matter. People were going and buying as much as they could. And it was, again, the spread of misinformation. And HEB sort of said, look, we're going to shut this down because our supply chain is strong. We are confident in what we've done. We actually prepped for some of this. We have planned for some of this to happen. We're good. But it was that constant panic that people were driving into others that was causing the real challenges we had in the supply chain, or some of the challenges, not all of them, but some of them.
So Justin, what major change will we likely witness to the global supply chain as a result of this pandemic?
I think one of the things we talked about is transparency of supply chain. And I think we may get to some of this a little bit later, but the more and more that I think our manufacturers of both products and services can share and be open about not just what's on the shelf today or, how things move and when they move, but what's coming, what's down the path. I think that was one of the biggest things we had with COVID is, again, people thought, oh goodness, I'm going to run out of this and it's not going to be available for 6 months. And as information becomes easier to share, for example, Amazon, I think Amazon does a really good job of, hey, we're out of this. The next time it will be available is within, this can ship in 2 weeks' time. That will become more and more exact as we go. And I think people will become more and more exact on when will it be available? When will it ship to me? When will it ship to a certain store? And, technology and the data availability is only getting stronger. And as we get more artificial intelligence and we can start to predict when things will become available, when they will be ready on the shelf or when they'll be ready to be delivered to your house, I think you'll find a lot more transparency of that. And that will help with some of that and come out sooner from suppliers and manufacturers just to try and help, calm people down so that they don't have over purchasing or panicking about when they'll be able to receive something.
Okay, so let's put COVID aside for just a second. So Justin, what has been the single greatest unforeseen shift or event in the supply chain field since the start of your career? And then Dr. Sweeney, you can follow up with us.
Yeah, this is, for me, is a fairly easy one. I think technology, data, and if you look at things like robotics and artificial intelligence, that's been the biggest change for me. And I would say, especially on the procurement of material side. I mean, you can look at, and I've raised Amazon, a couple of times already, but I think they're just the best example of how fast a company can develop their supply chain. And if you look at artificial intelligence, most of us use Amazon now to buy stuff for our homes, where you get to a place where Amazon will tell you you need a new air filter or a new toothbrush before you actually know you need it. And that's just the ability for the artificial intelligence and machine learning to happen, where it starts to look at trends and looks at behaviors of what you search for. When did you buy something? What are seasonal purchases you normally have? And it starts making suggestions for you. That in our personal space is happening in the business space as well. So for example, with BP, we're using Amazon for certain products for offshore materials or onshore materials to develop energy. Well, we can get to the same level of service where Amazon can perhaps tell us when we need a new fuel filter or oil filter or hard hat before we actually really know we need it or haven't thought about we needed it. And I just think that the faster robotics where we can remove people from, potentially safety critical roles where they were exposed to something that may have been, a high risk before, you can have a robot perform those tasks, or you can have things like artificial intelligence that are helping you with your speed and efficiency. That's been the single biggest change is technology has developed so fast that, from when I entered 20 years ago to now is the biggest drastic change I've seen.
So I've been in supply chain a lot less for a lot less time than you have. So my change during my career is probably not going to be anywhere near as drastic because I haven't been around for the tech revolution. It was kind of already done by the time I got majorly involved. You have to remember I only graduated in 2015 with my PhD. So that's only been a scant 5 years. What I will say though, and I'll say this from the academic side because that's what I have the most experience with. In academia and when we're doing supply chain research now, one of the things that I've noticed there's been a paradigm shift around is considering people's behaviors. And I don't necessarily mean that in a way that's differentiated from what Justin was just talking about, but essentially what we're trying to do in a lot of the models that we're building of supply chains now, especially those that are focused on B2C transactions, is we're actually looking at how different things that supply chains do may trigger responses in people behaviorally or emotionally that leads to different types of purchasing behaviors or different types of relationships with their firm than you would expect otherwise. And it's really kind of getting a little bit of traction from a field known as behavioral economics, which looks at how real people respond to theoretical situations in economics. We're starting to do that now in supply chain. And what we found is that people don't behave necessarily the way you would expect them to from a theoretical perspective. I think Justin hit on it a little bit with his answer when he talked about people's buying behaviors in response to the initial days of the COVID pandemic. But we're starting to now try to account for that. You know, we noticed a problem, particularly with COVID, but in other places where people's buying behaviors, usage behaviors, purchase behaviors were not in line with what you would expect given the actions people have taken to provide better service or lower cost in the supply chain. So including that end customer's reactions and their, behaviors in models, I think is really the next thing that we're doing from a supply chain perspective. For academic research, at least.
Yeah, and Jamie, I think if you're, for the folks watching this video, that's the advice I would give is that, think about what Kevin just said and what I said, which is the technology development, hasn't always been there. I mean, I could say in the last 10 years, it's incredibly changed the landscape, and it's one that I've had to grow through. But there's others like Kevin that have sort of just started with this technology development. When individuals are graduating with their undergraduate or their MBA and they're going into the work world within supply chain, think about you're going to be with a lot of people like myself that have not grown up in the technology world. And although I think I'm a little bit of a fast adopter, there are others that are not. And this is the advantage you can bring as an undergrad or as a recent MBA graduate coming in the work world. You've grown up with technology. This isn't new to you, but you'll be working with people that it is new to, and they may not be adapting as fast or learning as fast. That's your competitive advantage in the work world. You've got that advantage, go with that. And to Kevin's point about behaviors, come in there with some confidence, come in there with the view that you can help and support and make your company more efficient and effective. If you do it in the right way and not in a cocky way, but as in a confident way, you can be really successful and drive a whole lot of change and be a competitive advantage to a company as an individual and as a mindset. So that's the advice I would give is, harness what you've grown up with in that technology world. Come in there with the idea of what is behavioral learning, what is behaviors that people are going to want to do, and be adaptive. If you can do that, then you'll be a good advantage and a good hire for someone coming into the work world.
I think this would be a great place for me to jump in and wrap things up. I mean, it's been a great conversation, and honestly, I think we could go for a couple more hours. Perhaps
hopefully
we'll have
people aren't bored yet, Clayton. Hopefully we kept it.
Yeah, no, there's definitely room for more in-depth discussions across the broader spectrum of supply chain. So maybe we'll have a second series just on supply chain. Both of your thoughts were great. So I want to take the time just to thank you both for your time today and the valuable insights and wisdom you've shared with us. Your intellectual contributions to today's discussion are surely going to provide the student body an increased appreciation and awareness of the field of supply chain. Thank you very much to the wonderful moderator, Jamie, for her excellent moderation skills. Jamie's been a staple in our engagement series this semester, and we're forever grateful for her efforts. As I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, today marks the final installment of our 2020 engagement series. We're able to bring you 3 discussions if you weren't able to get to them all. I encourage you to go back to the channel and watch them. Although it's our last installment, we're already planning for next semester. We'd love to hear from you all. Specifically, we want to know what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy, what we could do better, and what else you would like for us to bring you next semester. Feel free to reach out to us via email or social media. We're always trying to improve. Finally, I want to say thank you to all of our MBA Student Association members and the guests that joined us this semester. It's been an honor and a privilege to share these moments with you all. I hope you all received as much as we did. In closing, I want to remind everybody to be fearless. Believe in your dreams, define not only who you are, but what you are. Be a bridge, not a barrier. And most importantly, stay dedicated. Thank you.